Earlier in the course we spoke about your general safety obligation, and one of those 4 obligations was a safe vessel. Now this next section, routine maintenance, will help you satisfy that safety obligation. It's important that you comply with your owner's manufacturer's operations manual. Every time you take your boat out on the water, make sure you do all your pre-departure checks. Make sure you look at your steering systems, your fuel systems, make sure you have a look at your propulsion system, all your electronics on board your vessel. Every single little aspect of your vessel, your bilges, your batteries, your starting systems must all be looked at very, very thoroughly. Keep everything in good working condition and make sure that you satisfy your general safety obligation.
So just with some routine maintenance, you want to check out the fuel tank system. What I would always do is make sure this cap here where you fill it up is down nice and tight and firm and is sealed on the top so it doesn't allow any water in, and always keep fresh fuel in the boat. What we will do is get up in the boat in a second, have a look through the fuel filter and fuel lines, but here on the exit side of the fuel tank is the fuel breathers. You'd want to make sure that they're not blocked. It's quite easy for anything to bugs and stuff to be crawled up in there, and then you've got a blockage which is going to create pressure. So let's get into the boat and have a look at the rest of the fuel system. So when we're talking about the fuel tank on the inside of the boat, this one's actually underfloor, so it's really hard to inspect anything at that end, but you'd normally find if it had a leak that you'd be getting a little bit of petrol coming out of your bungs after you finish boating, so always keep an eye out for that. What it does is bring the fuel lines up here, which you'd want to make sure are in really good condition. It's very common that they go hard and brittle. Make sure you've got some great fuel clamps here that are nice and tight. This is the fuel filter, which is also acts as a water separating filter. You should replace that. You know, most manufacturers recommend every 100 hours or yearly. It just unscrews and you can screw a new one on. It's very easy to do. I run a plastic shield over my battery switch here. I run dual batteries. You want to make sure everything's nice and clean. I run it up in both so it actually charges battery back to both batteries. You can isolate it overnight to position 1. Then in the morning you've got a nice fresh battery over in 2, and obviously at home in the garage I turn the switch off and that stores the battery. So let's get in and have a look through the battery system. So as far as maintenance to your batteries required, I'd always make sure that the terminals are clean and they're also tight. Make sure they're fixed down well. In this battery, this is a seal battery, so it actually has an indicator here which is a window, and it has a little guideline making sure that the colour represents how much charge it has. Make sure it's charged before you go to sea. This one's showing green is okay, and looking in the hole, green it is. So we're good to go. So make sure your battery's secure, locked down with a nice good clamp. Make sure it's in good condition and it's not deteriorated, and you can double check it. So it's pretty easy to check your battery charge just with a little tester. Check its load, and if it's a wet battery, all you've got to do is undo this cap. You can go to Repco and buy a hydrometer, put that in and check the electrolyte level and make sure it's good to go. That's what I would do. Make sure they're fully charged before you head out at sea. So when you have an external tank, some good things to check, follow this. Make sure your cap's secure, make sure your air breather's open, make sure you've got a good hose clamp here, the fuel line's in good condition. Check for any visual damage here with the primer bulb. Make sure the clamps are nice and tight and firm. Make sure you've got a good fitting. Connect it to the engine. Prime the fuel up till that bulb goes nice and hard. Double check you haven't got any leaks, and then the engine should be good to go. Make sure you got fresh fuel. Fuel only lasts about 3 months these days, so get rid of your old fuel, make sure it's nice and clean, and you shouldn't have any problems. So with steering, let's just check some main things that we need to know about. Firstly, at the top here there's a cap. You'd want to make sure this is hydraulic steering, so you want to make sure that's full of fluid. You'd want to check that the steering wheel turns. Check for any visible leaks wiping underneath. Good to go. If we go down to the rear where the motor is, we'll check out the steering there on the hydraulic setup. All it has is some lines that run hydraulic fluid back to the rear of the engine. Let's go and check there for any damage and preventative maintenance.
Yep.
So here at the motor end, you want to check the lines aren't perished. They're all sealed. You can see it's really dry here. You want to check the seal both ends. Make sure you can even check it by wiping, making sure there's no evidence of anything weeping there. And that steering is good to go. Let me get up to the helm and I'll show you how it works from full lock to lock. So a good tip before you head out is make sure that you got full steerage both sides from lock to lock. Very uncommon on a hydraulic steering for it to seize, but we're going to go over and have a look at a mechanical setup, which is common as to seize the steering while it's sitting in the garage and you don't know. You go to the boat ramp, put it in the water, go to take off and it's got no steering because the cable's locked up. Let's go and have a look and I'll show you why. So this is our traditional mechanical steering that has a rod that steers off the helm that pushes out to turn the engine. You can see this one's really dry, so if we don't lubricate that with some oil, you're going to find that'll just seize up while it's sitting in the garage. Next time you go boating, you get in the boat and you won't have any steering, so make sure you keep that nice and lubricated with some oil. Doesn't matter what oil, any oil will be fine, just make it sure it's wet at all times. I'd check that the linkages are nice and tight, bolted to the engine correctly, and I think that's all we need to check. So some other checks that we need to make sure are right. Make sure that we've got trim working. You can trim it up and down on this engine. For towing, this even has its motor support built into the engine, locked down, ready to roll. Some tie down straps on the boat, perfect. To flush the engine, you need to flush it after every use. This particular engine, 2 ways to flush. Traditional flushes, which slide over these water pickups. You must turn the hose on before you start the engine. Let's do that. So a lot of manufacturers also offer option 2 for flushing, where you don't even need to start the engine, you just back flush the water system. Let's do that. Simple hose fitting there, turn it on, and we'll start to see some water come out through the center of the propeller, and it just back flushes through the engine, circulates. It actually has a little bit more pressure in the hose than it does have through the cooling system. Another good check is make sure that this prop nut is nice and tight, and make sure you got the pin through to stop the nut from coming undone. And just have a visual check and a spin, make sure there's no fishing line or anything caught around from your last trip out. Make sure your blades are in good order and you should be good to go. So a lot of your big 2-stroke engines are oil injected, so you want to check that the oil not only is sufficient for the day out. I'd actually fill this. No substitute for having full tank of oil. I'd make sure all the lines and everything and the fittings are in good working order, and from there go to the engine and make sure all the oil lines on the engine are in good condition and there's good clamps and that on them, because we can't afford an engine failure because an oil line blew off. So let's go over to the engine and have a look. So the oil line comes up into this little filter here, which we'll show you in a sec. Make sure the clamps are good and it hasn't got any blockages or any water in it. And also check over here, there's another little fuel filter, and the oil line runs all through to all cylinders. And over the other side of the engine, it has its secondary fuel filter, which we'll show you in a sec. I'd always make sure you replace that with the other fuel filter on the boat, and you should be good to go. So with 4-strokes, commonly they have a dipstick. Just like your car, you want to make sure that oil level's in full before you head out. If it's not, you can normally find the filler cap is, you know, a high vis color or something. All you got to do is unscrew it, top up the oil with the appropriate manufacturer's specified oil, and you should be good to go. There's a fuel filter here which we can have a look to see if there's any water or if there's any dirt in there. Make sure that's good to go. Make sure that the engine's nice and tight with its clamp screws. A lot of engines, big ones, are bolted through, so you don't have to worry about that. You'd also want to check if it's bolted through that it's got some silicone there to stop the boat from leaking. Make sure all the pivot points work, and you should be right to head out. So another wise tip to make sure you keep your motor, here's a mounting point for a shackle. You can run a bit of chain here with a shackle, so it's always fixed to the outboard. So if those thumb screws for some reason come loose and the engine pops off while you're driving along, the chain's going to stop it from going anywhere. It's pretty common that people don't run that and they drop an outboard when they come back off the throttle, because all the pressure runs forward and the motor lifts up, and down it goes, and it's all over.
Once again, we've taken the time to give you a comprehensive list of all the things you need to consider below, so please take the time to go through.